Isabella? Your Grace, the door was locked from inside. Then where is my wife? No forced entry, no struggle. Then she trusted whoever came for her. Your Grace, the East Gate opened at midnight.
By dawn, the palace of Ravenshold would be surrounded by soldiers, torches, and screaming rumors. But at midnight there was only silence, an empty bridal chamber, a crimson-stained letter on white silk sheets, and a duke on his knees gripping a wedding ring that would never reach her finger. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, she was running, and someone was hunting her. Welcome back to the Royal Duke Diaries. Settle in, dim the lights, and let this forbidden love story unfold. The candles in the ducal bedchamber of Ravenshold Palace had burned low, their flames trembling against the marble walls like frightened witnesses. Duke Edmund Draven stood at the threshold of the room that should have held his bride, his hand frozen on the door. The silk sheets were disturbed. A crystal vase lay shattered on the floor, and there, folded with deliberate precision atop the pillow where Isabella's head should have rested, was a single letter, its edges soaked dark red. His heart did not simply break. It stopped. "Isabella," he whispered, the name catching like a blade in his throat. He crossed the room in 3 strides, boots crushing broken glass, and snatched the letter from the bed. His hands that had signed treaties, commanded armies, silenced entire courts with a glance, shook as he unfolded the bloodstained parchment. 6 words. Only 6 words, written in a hand that was almost hers, but not quite. "Forgive me. I was never yours." The Duke's breath left him in a ragged exhale. Behind him, the palace doors burst open, and the frantic voices of guards and servants flooded in. But Edmund Draven heard none of it. He heard only the echo of a promise she had made to him 3 weeks earlier, beneath a different moon, in a different world, when she had still believed she was safe in his arms. The next day, the investigation began before the sun had fully risen. Ravenshold's corridors, usually filled with the quiet dignity of court life, now echoed with the clipped orders of the royal guard and the hushed, frightened whispers of servants who had loved their new duchess-to-be. Edmund stood in the throne room, still in yesterday's wedding attire, the white rose still pinned crookedly to his lapel, the same rose Isabella had tucked there herself, laughing, her fingers lingering a moment too long against his chest. "Your Grace," said Captain Reyes, his most trusted man, "there is no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle beyond the vase." "Then someone she trusted took her," Edmund said, his voice a low growl of restrained fury. "Or she left on her own." He did not want to believe the second possibility. He couldn't, because 3 weeks ago, Isabella Vane had looked him in the eyes and told him she had never wanted anything the way she wanted him. A few days later, the court was ablaze with scandal. Whispers slithered through every ballroom, every terroom, every gilded hallway of the capital. The Duke's bride fled. There's blood, murder, some say. Betrayal, others insist. Lady Constance Ashworth, daughter of the powerful Ashworth family, the woman Edmund had been expected to marry before Isabella upended every careful plan the crown had made for him, smiled behind her fan as the rumors spread. "How tragic," she murmured to her companions, though her eyes glittered with something far from sorrow. "Perhaps the Duke will come to his senses now." But Edmund Draven had no intention of coming to his senses. He had every intention of tearing the kingdom apart to find the woman who had vanished with nothing but blood and a lie. To understand how a duke feared across 3 kingdoms fell to his knees for a woman with nothing to her name, we must go back to the night everything began. 6 months earlier, the Ravenshold Winter Gala was the single most important event of the royal calendar, a night where dukes, princes, and foreign dignitaries gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to remind one another, in the sweetest possible language, exactly who held power and who did not. Duke Edmund Draven despised it. He stood near the edge of the ballroom, a glass of untouched wine in hand, watching the swirl of silk and jewels with the detached boredom of a man who had long ago stopped believing anyone in this room saw him as more than his title. Women approached him all evening with practiced smiles and calculated laughter. He answered in clipped, polite nothings, his dark eyes cold enough to freeze the Ravenshold fountains outside. He was, by every account, a man carved from granite, powerful, untouchable, alone. And then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and a woman walked in who did not belong. Not because she lacked grace, but because she seemed entirely unaware of the performance everyone else in the room was so desperately playing. She wore a deep emerald gown, simpler than the others, her dark curls pinned loosely enough that a few strands had already escaped to frame her face. She moved through the crowd not with the practiced glide of nobility, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned, the hard way, how to survive rooms that did not want her in them. Edmund's glass stopped halfway to his lips. Who is she? Later that night, Isabella Vane had not wanted to attend the gala. She was there only because her aunt, Lady Marrow, had insisted her needlework skills be shown off to the court, an excuse to parade her in front of wealthy men who might overlook her lack of fortune if her hands were skilled enough. Isabella hated every second of it. She hated the way eyes slid over her curves with open judgment, hated the whispered comments about her modest gown, hated most of all the hollow ache of not belonging anywhere. She was reaching for a glass of champagne when a deep voice spoke behind her. "You're the only person in this room who looks like she'd rather be anywhere else." She turned and found herself looking directly into the darkest, most intense eyes she had ever seen. Duke Edmund Draven. Even without an introduction, she knew him. Everyone knew him. The Duke who never smiled. The Duke who had turned down 3 arranged marriages and terrified half the court simply by existing. "Is it that obvious?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Something flickered across his stern face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to feel dangerous. "Only to me," he said. That evening, they talked for nearly an hour, tucked into a quiet alcove away from prying eyes. The Duke, who spoke to no one, and the seamstress's niece, who was supposed to be invisible. Isabella found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years, at his dry, unexpected wit. Edmund found himself listening, truly listening, to a woman who spoke to him not as a title, but as a man. "You're not what I expected," he admitted quietly, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning, with visible effort, to her eyes. "What did you expect?" she asked, breathless despite herself. "Someone easier to look away from." The words hung between them, charged and dangerous, before Lady Marrow's voice cut through the moment, calling Isabella away. As she left, Edmund's eyes followed her across the ballroom, and something inside the untouchable Duke, something he had buried for years, stirred awake. The following morning, Edmund could not stop thinking about her. He told himself it was simply curiosity, a puzzle, nothing more. Dukes did not fall for seamstresses' nieces. Dukes married for alliances, for land, for power. That was the law of his world, one he had followed his entire life without complaint. And yet, when his steward mentioned that a shipment of fabric was due to arrive from the Vane workshop that very afternoon, Edmund found an excuse to be in the palace's east wing at precisely that hour. He told himself it meant nothing. He was wrong. A few days later, Isabella had not expected to see the Duke again. Certainly not standing in the doorway of the small workshop where she measured fabric for the palace's tailoring needs, looking entirely too large and too commanding for a room full of silk and thread. "Your Grace," she said, startled, dipping into a hasty curtsy. "I wasn't told. I came to inspect the fabric personally," he said, though his eyes were fixed on her, not the bolts of silk behind her. "You've never inspected fabric in your life," she said before she could stop herself. A corner of his mouth lifted. The ghost of a smile she was quickly learning was rare and precious. "No," he admitted, "I haven't." The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them dared name yet. Isabella's pulse raced as he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell cedar and rain on his coat. "Why are you really here?" she whispered. His dark eyes searched her face, torn between duty and desire. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I couldn't stay away." By the end of the week, word spread quietly through the palace staff. The Duke had been seen more than once in the workshop wing. Servants whispered. Lady Marrow, ever ambitious, began to hope for a match far beyond what she'd dared imagine. But not everyone was pleased. Lady Constance Ashworth, whose family had spent years quietly maneuvering toward a union between herself and the Duke, watched the rumors spread with cold, calculating fury. "A seamstress," she hissed to her brother, Lord Edmund Ashworth, in the privacy of their townhouse. "He would humiliate our family for being a seamstress?" Edmund's eyes narrowed, calculating in a different, far more dangerous way. "Then we make certain," he said quietly, "that this infatuation does not survive the season." That evening, Edmund found Isabella on the palace's east balcony, where she often escaped during her deliveries to breathe air that wasn't thick with wealth and expectation. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, stepping up beside her, his voice low. "I'm not alone anymore," she replied softly, glancing at him. The moon caught the emerald flecks in her eyes, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Edmund's hand found hers on the balcony railing. A small touch, but it sent a current through both of them. "Isabella," he said, her name unfamiliar and yet perfectly right in his mouth. "I have spent my entire life being told what I am permitted to want. I find that I no longer care." Her breath caught. "Your Grace, Edmund," he corrected softly. "When it is only us, call me Edmund." She looked up at him, vulnerable and wondering, and for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Duke Edmund Draven leaned down and pressed his lips to a woman's temple. Not her mouth, not yet, but close enough that the restraint nearly undid them both. "I'm frightened," she admitted against his jaw. "Of me? Of how much I already want this." A few weeks later, their secret meetings became a fragile ritual. Stolen minutes in gardens, quiet conversations in the workshop after hours, letters passed through a trusted maid. Isabella told herself it could not last. Dukes did not marry seamstresses, but every time she resolved to end it, Edmund would appear again, dismantling her resolve with nothing more than the intensity in his gaze. He, in turn, found himself changed by her. The cold, distant Duke softened in ways his own staff noticed with quiet astonishment. He laughed more. He listened more. He began, for the first time, to imagine a life that was his own, not simply his title. But not everyone watched this transformation with joy. Meanwhile, across the city, in a dim, private study, Lord Edmund Ashworth met with a man whose face remained hidden beneath a hood. "The girl has no family of consequence," Edmund said, sliding a pouch of coins across the table. "No one will ask questions if she simply disappears from his affections." The hooded man said nothing, only pocketed the coins with practiced ease. "I don't want her harmed," Edmund added, an edge of warning in his voice. "Only removed, discreetly, permanently, if necessary." What Edmund Ashworth did not know, could not have known, was that the woman he sought to erase was not who she appeared to be at all. Isabella Vane carried a secret buried so deep that even she did not fully understand it yet, a secret tied to a name whispered in hushed disgrace throughout the royal court 20 years ago, a secret that would soon shatter everything. The following month, the Duke's growing attachment to Isabella could no longer be ignored by the crown. Edmund was summoned before the King's Council, where his father's old advisor, Lord Bramwell, delivered the message plainly. "You are the last unmarried Duke of Ravenshold's founding bloodline," Bramwell said. "The crown requires an alliance, Your Grace, not a scandal." "I intend to marry Isabella Vane," Edmund said, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. The council erupted into disapproval, but Edmund remained unmoved, his jaw set with the same iron will that had won him battles and silenced rivals for a decade. "She is not of noble blood," Bramwell warned. "Then I will make her noble blood," Edmund said coldly, "the moment I place a ring on her finger." That same night, when Edmund told Isabella what he intended, that he would defy the crown itself to marry her, she wept, overwhelmed by a love she had never dared believe she deserved. "You would risk everything," she whispered. "Your title, your standing. For me?" He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears with a tenderness the court would never have believed him capable of. "Isabella," he said, his voice raw, "I would burn Ravenshold to the ground before I let another day pass without you as mine." She kissed him then, their first true kiss, slow and trembling and full of everything neither of them had dared to say aloud. The world outside the garden walls ceased to exist. There was only him, only her, only the fragile, dangerous, beautiful thing blooming between them. Neither of them noticed the shadow watching from the hedges beyond. A few days later, the announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Newspapers speculated wildly. The court buzzed with scandal and delight in equal measure. Lady Marrow wept with joy at her niece's impossible fortune. But in a quiet, candle-lit room, Lady Constance Ashworth read the announcement with trembling hands, her carefully constructed future collapsing before her eyes. "He chose her," she whispered, disbelieving. "He actually chose her." Edmund placed a hand on his sister's shoulder, his expression carved from cold patience. "Then we accelerate our plans," he said quietly. "The wedding will not happen as he intends it." 1 month before the wedding, As preparations for the royal wedding consumed the palace, strange things began happening around Isabella. A carriage nearly struck her outside the workshop. An accident, the driver insisted, though Isabella noticed the wheels had been deliberately loosened. A note, unsigned, arrived at Lady Marrow's home warning Isabella to leave before it's too late, for her own good. She told no one, not wanting to burden Edmund during such a critical political moment, a decision that would soon prove devastating. Edmund, meanwhile, noticed her growing unease but attributed it to natural wedding day nerves, never suspecting the danger closing in around the woman he loved more than his own life. 2 weeks before the wedding, a masked ball was held in celebration of the impending union, the last great gathering before the wedding itself. Isabella, dressed in midnight blue, felt eyes on her from every direction, though she could not place the source of her unease. Then, across the crowded ballroom, she saw him. A man in a silver mask, watching her with unsettling familiarity, as though he recognized her, though she was certain she had never seen him before in her life. "Do I know you?" she asked when he approached, something cold slithering down her spine. The masked stranger's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Not yet," he said quietly. "But you will remember me soon enough, Isabella Vane, or should I say, Lady Isabella Ashcombe." Her blood ran cold. "That's not my name," she whispered. "Isn't it?" His smile deepened, cruel and knowing. "Ask your aunt what happened to your mother 20 years ago. Ask her why the Ashcombe name was erased from every royal record in the kingdom." Before she could respond, he vanished into the crowd, leaving her trembling, her entire understanding of herself suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. Later that night, Isabella confronted Lady Marrow the moment she returned home, her voice shaking with a fear she couldn't fully name. "Who is Isabella Ashcombe?" she demanded. Lady Marrow went pale, the color draining entirely from her face. "Where did you hear that name?" she whispered. "Aunt, tell me the truth." Lady Marrow sank into a chair, tears filling her eyes as 20 years of carefully guarded secrets threatened to spill free. "Your mother," she said finally, her voice breaking, "was Duchess Rosalind Ashcombe. She was murdered when you were an infant, and I have spent your entire life protecting you from the people who wanted her dead." Isabella's world tilted violently on its axis. "Why would anyone want to kill my mother?" Lady Marrow's answer came in a whisper thick with old grief and fresh terror. "Because your mother's bloodline had a legitimate claim to lands the Ashworth family stole 20 years ago, and if the wrong people learn you're alive, Isabella, they will finish what they started." The next morning, Isabella did not tell Edmund what she'd learned. Not yet. She told herself she needed time to understand it herself first, a decision born of fear, not deception, though it would soon feel like the latter to the man who loved her. But Edmund Ashworth already knew. He had known for weeks, ever since his private investigator uncovered the truth Lady Marrow had spent 2 decades burying. The masked man at the ball had not been a stranger warning Isabella out of kindness. He had been Edmund's own agent, sent to unsettle her, to sow fear and confusion before the final plan was set into motion. 1 week before the wedding. The wedding preparations continued in a haze of silk fittings, floral arrangements, and royal protocol, while Isabella moved through it all like a woman underwater, drowning silently in secrets she didn't know how to voice. Edmund noticed the change in her, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the distance that had crept into her gaze. "Isabella," he said one evening, catching her hands in his, "something is wrong. Tell me." She looked up at him, torn between the safety of his arms and the terror of what she now understood, that loving him, marrying him, might be the very thing that got her killed. "I'm frightened," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Of what?" "Of losing everything," she whispered, unable yet to give voice to the truth. "Of losing you." He pulled her against his chest, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You could never lose me. Whatever this is, we face it together." If only she had believed him enough to tell him the truth that night. 3 days before the wedding, Edmund Ashworth made his move with surgical precision. He arranged for a private letter to reach Isabella, forged in a hand disturbingly similar to her mother's, containing details only someone deeply embedded in the Ashcombe tragedy could have known. The letter claimed that if Isabella proceeded with the wedding, the truth of her bloodline would be exposed publicly, destroying not only her but Edmund's entire family legacy in a scandal so severe it would cost him his title, his lands, and everything he had built. "Marry him," the letter warned, "and you will destroy him. Disappear, and he will grieve, but he will survive. Isabella read the letter alone in her room, her hands shaking, tears streaming silently down her face. She believed with devastating sincerity that walking away was the only way to save the man she loved. She did not know it was a lie engineered by the very family determined to see her erased entirely. The night before the wedding, Edmund found her on the east balcony one final time, the same place where he had first touched her hand beneath the moonlight. "Tomorrow," he said softly, coming to stand beside her, "you become my wife." She turned to him, memorizing every line of his face as though she already knew, somewhere deep inside, that this might be the last time. "Edmund," she whispered, "whatever happens, I need you to know that I have never loved anything the way I love you." Something in her tone unsettled him. "Isabella, you're frightening me." "I'm sorry," she said, tears slipping free despite her efforts. "I'm so sorry." He caught her face in his hands, desperate to understand. "Sorry for what? Tell me what's wrong. Let me fix it." "Some things," she whispered brokenly, "can't be fixed, only survived." She kissed him then, deep, desperate, final. A kiss that tasted of goodbye, though neither of them said the word aloud. Edmund pulled her closer, sensing something was wrong but utterly unprepared for what tomorrow would bring. The next day, their wedding day, the ceremony was, by every outward account, magnificent. The chapel of Ravenshold overflowed with white roses and candlelight. Nobility from across the kingdom gathered to witness the union of the untouchable Duke and his mysterious bride. Isabella walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, her face composed into serene calm despite the storm raging inside her. She had made her decision. Tonight, after the ceremony, after the celebration, she would disappear, vanish into the night to protect the man standing at the altar, watching her approach with a look of such open, unguarded love that it nearly shattered her resolve entirely. "I love you," she thought, forcing a trembling smile as she reached him. "I love you enough to let you hate me." They exchanged vows beneath the golden light of 100 candles. Edmund's voice was steady, sure, unwavering, a man who had never been more certain of anything in his life. Isabella's voice broke twice, tears disguised as joy slipping down her cheeks. When he kissed her as his wife, the chapel erupted in applause. Neither of them knew it would be the last time they touched as husband and wife for a very long time. That night, the wedding feast stretched long into the evening. Toasts, dancing, the entire court gathered to celebrate what many still called the scandal of the decade. Edmund barely left Isabella's side all night, his hand finding hers again and again as though reassuring himself she was truly real. "You've been quiet," he murmured during a slow dance, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm simply happy," she lied softly, memorizing the warmth of his hands at her waist, the low, rare sound of his laughter, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the entire glittering room. When the celebrations finally ended and they retired to the ducal bedchamber, Edmund drew her into his arms with a tenderness that nearly broke her resolve entirely. "Wife," he murmured against her hair, testing the word like a sacred thing. "Husband," she whispered back, and for one fragile, perfect hour, she allowed herself to simply love him without the shadow of what was coming. It was, she would later think, the happiest hour of her entire life. Near midnight, Edmund fell asleep first, exhausted from the long celebration, his arm draped protectively across her waist even in slumber. Isabella lay awake beside him for a long time, memorizing the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body against hers, the quiet trust in his relaxed features. Then, with tears streaming silently down her face, she slipped from his embrace. She dressed quickly in the darkness, retrieved the small bag she had hidden days earlier, and paused at the door to look back one final time at the man she was leaving to save. "Forgive me," she whispered into the darkness. "I was never yours to keep." She wrote the words on parchment, pressed her hand, still bleeding faintly from where she'd cut it earlier to make the message believable, to make it feel like danger rather than choice, against the paper, and placed it on his pillow. Then Isabella Vane, or Isabella Ashcombe, or whoever she truly was, disappeared into the night, unaware that the moment she stepped beyond the palace gates, Edmund Ashworth's men were already waiting in the shadows, and the letter she'd left behind was about to convince the entire kingdom, including the man she loved most, that she was either a traitor or a corpse. Which brings us back to where our story began, a duke on his knees, a blood-stained letter, and a kingdom about to discover that some disappearances are far more dangerous than they appear. The palace remained in chaos for days. Edmund barely slept, barely ate, driving his men through every corner of the city in search of any trace of his missing bride. Every lead ended in silence. Every rumor dissolved into nothing. But late one evening, alone in the bedchamber that still smelled faintly of her perfume, Edmund read the blood-stained letter for the 100th time, and noticed something he had missed in his grief-stricken haze the first time. The handwriting was close, achingly close, but it was not, he realized with sudden, electrifying certainty, entirely hers. She didn't write this alone, he whispered into the empty room, his despair hardening into something far more dangerous, determination. Someone made her write it, or someone wrote it for her. Whatever had happened to Isabella, Edmund Draven was no longer a grieving husband. He was a duke about to burn his entire kingdom down to find her. The duke on his knees. The blood-stained letter. A bride vanished into the dark. But what Duke Edmund Draven was about to uncover would prove that some love stories don't end in tragedy. They end in war. Welcome back to the Royal Duke Diaries. Let's continue. 3 days after the wedding night, Ravenshold Palace had transformed from a place of celebration into something closer to a fortress under siege. Guards patrolled every corridor. Investigators combed the gardens. And at the center of it all stood Duke Edmund Draven, unshaven, hollow-eyed, and more dangerous than the court had ever seen him. He had not slept. He had barely eaten. He held the blood-stained letter like a man holding the last piece of his sanity. The handwriting, he said again to Captain Reyes, spreading the letter across his desk beside a stack of Isabella's old workshop notes. Look at the S. Look at how she loops it. This is close, too close, but it's wrong. Reyes leaned over the parchment, comparing the two. His brow furrowed. You're right, Your Grace. It's a forgery. A skilled one, but a forgery. Relief and fury crashed through Edmund in equal measure. His wife had not chosen to leave him. Someone had made it look that way. Then she's alive, he said, his voice low and lethal. And someone in this kingdom is going to tell me exactly where. The next morning, Lady Marrow arrived at the palace gates, summoned by a letter from Edmund himself, one that had made her weep the moment she read it. I know the letter is false. I know you are hiding something. Tell me the truth, or I will tear this city apart stone by stone until I find it myself. She was shown into his private study, where Edmund stood by the window, his back rigid, his composure hanging by a single thread. You know something, he said without turning. You've known something since before the wedding. Lady Marrow's hands trembled in her lap. Your Grace, Tell me. He turned, and the raw devastation in his eyes broke through what remained of her resolve. And so, for the second time in a week, Lady Marrow told the truth she had buried for 20 years, of Duchess Rosalind Ashcombe, murdered when Isabella was an infant, of stolen lands, and a bloodline erased from royal record, of a masked man at the winter ball who had planted the seed of fear that sent Isabella running. She believed leaving would save you, Marrow finished, tears streaming down her weathered face. She believed that if she stayed, the truth of her mother's death would destroy your family alongside hers. Edmund's jaw tightened until it ached. Who told her this? I don't know, Marrow whispered, but I know who benefits most from Isabella Ashcombe disappearing forever. That same afternoon, the name arrived at Edmund's desk within the hour, delivered by Reyes with the particular grimness of a man who already suspected the answer would be politically catastrophic. Ashworth. 20 years ago, the Ashcombe estate, including 3,000 acres of prime northern farmland, had been reclaimed by the crown following Duchess Rosalind's mysterious death, then quietly granted to the Ashworth family in gratitude for their loyalty during a border conflict. If Isabella Ashcombe were ever proven alive and legitimate, that grant would be void. The land, and the fortune built upon it, would revert to her. Edmund Ashworth had every reason in the world to make certain Isabella Ashcombe never stood before a court to claim it. And his sister Constance had every reason to want Isabella gone from Edmund's life entirely. They didn't just profit from her disappearance, Edmund said quietly, a cold, controlled fury settling into his bones. They orchestrated it. Meanwhile, Isabella woke in darkness. Her wrists were bound, not cruelly, but firmly. And the room around her was small, windowless, lit only by a single lamp. She had left the palace of her own will, walked willingly into the night to protect Edmund, only to be seized within a quarter-mile of the gates by men who moved with practiced, silent efficiency. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The masked man from the winter ball, though he no longer wore the mask. He was younger than she expected, with tired eyes and a face that held no cruelty, only a strange, weary resignation. "You're not going to hurt me," she said slowly, watching him. It wasn't a question. "No," the man admitted, setting down a plate of bread and water. "My orders were to frighten you away from the wedding, not to harm you. When you disappeared on your own, my employer saw an opportunity too valuable to waste." "Your employer," Isabella repeated. "Edmund Ashworth." Something flickered across the man's face, surprise quickly hidden. "You're sharper than they gave you credit for. Why are you doing this?" she asked. "What do you gain?" The man's jaw tightened. "My sister works in the Ashworth household. Edmund holds her wages, her debts, her family's tenancy over her head like an axe. I do what I'm told because the alternative is watching her starve." He looked away, shame flickering across his features. "I never wanted anyone to disappear the way your mother did." Isabella's breath caught. "You knew my mother?" "I knew of her," he said quietly. "Everyone in the old Ashcombe territories did. She was kind, beloved, and she was murdered so quietly that most of the kingdom simply forgot she existed at all." He met her eyes. "I won't let that happen to you too. Not truly. I'm supposed to keep you hidden until Edmund decides what to do with you. But I intend to help you get out, when the moment is right. I owe your mother's memory that much." That evening, Edmund summoned Edmund Ashworth to the palace under the pretense of discussing wedding-related condolences, a summons Edmund could not refuse without arousing suspicion he was desperate to avoid. The two men faced each other in Edmund's study, the air thick with unspoken accusations. "I understand your grief, your grace," Edmund said smoothly, "but surely you don't believe foul play. The letter was quite clear. She chose to leave." "The letter," Edmund said, his voice deceptively calm, "was forged, rather skillfully, almost as skillfully as the forged land grant that transferred Ashcombe territory to your family 20 years ago." Edmund's composed mass cracked, just slightly, just long enough for Edmund to see the truth beneath it. "I don't know what you're implying," Edmund said stiffly. "I'm not implying anything." Edmund stepped closer, his presence filling the room with barely restrained violence. "I am promising you, Lord Ashworth, if my wife is harmed in any way, I will not simply take back what your family stole. I will burn every asset, every title, every ounce of standing the Ashworth name has ever held, and I will enjoy every moment of it." Edmund's smile thinned to something brittle. "Threatening a fellow peer is a dangerous game, your grace. So is kidnapping a duchess," Edmund said softly. "Enjoy the days you have left believing you've won, Lord Ashworth. They are numbered." A few days later, Isabella's captivity stretched into a week, marked only by the quiet visits of the young man, whose name, she learned, was Tomas, bringing food and, more importantly, information. "Edmund grows anxious," Tomas told her one evening, glancing nervously at the door. "The Duke has hired investigators from 3 kingdoms. He's questioning everyone who worked the wedding, everyone who might have seen anything unusual. He knows the letter was forged." Isabella's heart lifted with painful hope. "He's looking for me." "He hasn't stopped," Tomas confirmed. "Word in the city says he hasn't slept more than a few hours since the wedding night. He's turning over every stone in Ravenshold." Tears filled her eyes, not from fear this time, but from a fierce, overwhelming love. She had left to protect him, believing her absence would spare him pain. Instead, she had only handed him a different, more agonizing wound. "I need to get a message to him," she said urgently. "He needs to know the truth, that I left to protect him, not to betray him." Tomas hesitated, glancing again at the locked door. "It's dangerous. If Edmund discovers I've helped you, please," Isabella whispered. "You said you wouldn't let what happened to my mother happen to me. This is how you keep that promise." Something in her voice, desperate, brave, utterly without artifice, seemed to settle the last of Tomas's hesitation. "Write it," he said quietly. "I'll find a way." 2 days later, the note reached Edmund through the most unlikely of channels, tucked inside a bolt of fabric delivered to the palace workshop, discovered by a sharp-eyed seamstress who recognized Isabella's handwriting immediately and rushed it to the Duke without a moment's hesitation. Edmund's hands shook as he unfolded it. "Edmund, I am alive. I left to protect you, not to leave you. The letter was written under duress. I bled my own hand to make it convincing, believing my absence would spare you a scandal that would destroy everything you've built. I understand now that I was wrong. I am being held somewhere near the old grain warehouses on the eastern docks. Please, if you still want me, come find me. I have never stopped loving you, not for a single moment." Edmund read the note 3 times before he trusted himself to speak. "Raise," he said, his voice raw with an emotion so overwhelming it nearly buckled his knees. "Assemble the men, now." That night, the eastern docks of Ravenshold were a maze of shadowed warehouses, salt air, and creaking ropes, a place far removed from the glittering ballrooms where Edmund and Isabella's story had begun. Edmund moved through the darkness with the focused, lethal calm of a man who had spent a decade commanding soldiers, his guards fanning out silently behind him. Inside a warehouse near the water's edge, Tomas kept watch nervously outside a locked storage room, having deliberately positioned himself to intercept and delay anyone who might come to check on the prisoner before the Duke's men arrived. When Edmund's guards finally located the building, Tomas raised no alarm. He simply stepped aside, unlocking the door with trembling hands. "She's inside," he said quietly. "Please, don't let Edmund's men know I helped her. My sister, you will be protected," Edmund said, something in the young man's desperate loyalty striking a chord of respect even through his own consuming urgency. Now, the door. The lock gave way and Edmund stepped inside the dim storage room, and there she was. Isabella rose from where she'd been sitting, disbelief and joy flooding her face all at once. Edmund, he crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms with a force that stole the breath from both of them, one hand cradling the back of her head as though he needed physical proof she was truly, solidly real. "I thought I'd lost you," he said into her hair, his voice breaking for the first time in 10 years of careful control. "I thought, I'm here," she whispered, clutching him just as fiercely. "I'm so sorry. I thought leaving would save you. I was wrong. I was so wrong." He pulled back just enough to cup her face in both hands, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that stole what little breath she had left. "You will never protect me by leaving me again. Do you understand? Whatever comes. Scandal danger, the entire kingdom against us. We face it together, or not at all." "Together," she echoed, tears slipping down her cheeks as he kissed her, desperate, fierce, and full of a relief so profound it left them both trembling. Outside, the guards had already moved to secure the warehouse, but their reunion was interrupted moments later by shouting. Edmund Ashworth himself had arrived, drawn by a frantic message from one of his men, his carefully composed mask finally completely shattered. "This is my property," Edmund snarled as guards restrained him. "You have no right." "I have every right," Edmund said coldly, stepping protectively in front of Isabella, "to reclaim my wife from the men who kidnapped her." He turned to Raise. "Arrest him. Kidnapping a duchess is treason against the crown itself." Edmund's face drained of color as the full weight of his miscalculation crashed down upon him. "You can't prove I have a forged letter matched to your family's private secretary's handwriting," Edmund said calmly. "A witness willing to testify to your orders, and a duchess who can identify your voice from her captivity. I have more than enough." As guards dragged Edmund away, screaming denials into the night, Isabella sagged against Edmund's side, exhaustion and relief finally overwhelming her. "Take me home," she whispered. "Always," he murmured, sweeping her into his arms entirely and carrying her out into the cool night air, away from the darkness that had nearly stolen her from him forever. The next morning, news of Edmund Ashworth's arrest tore through the capital like wildfire. The scandal that had begun as rumors of a fleeing bride transformed overnight into a story far more shocking: kidnapping, forgery, and a stolen inheritance 20 years in the making. Lady Constance Ashworth, watching her family's carefully constructed empire collapse in real time, arrived at the palace in a desperate bid to salvage what remained. "Your Grace," she said, forcing calm into her voice as she was shown into his study, "surely you understand my brother acted alone. I had no knowledge—" "Save it," Edmund said, not looking up from the documents before him. "I have letters, Lady Constance. Letters between you and your brother discussing quite explicitly how inconvenient it would be if Isabella Vane remained in my life. I believe the phrase you used was whatever it takes." Constance's composure finally cracked entirely. "I loved you," she said, her voice breaking. "I have loved you since we were children, and you chose a seamstress over everything I could have offered you." Edmund finally looked up, and there was no cruelty in his gaze, only a tired, absolute certainty. "I never loved you, Constance," he said quietly. "Not once. I am sorry that hurt you, but nothing that has happened these past weeks was caused by my choice to marry Isabella. It was caused by your family's choice to punish her for it." He gestured to the guards waiting at the door. "You will face the council for your part in this. What mercy you receive will depend entirely on your honesty going forward. A few days later, with Isabella safely returned and the Ashworth siblings awaiting trial, the kingdom's attention shifted from scandal to something far more astonishing: the emerging truth of Isabella's true identity. Lord Bramwell, the same council advisor who had once dismissed Isabella as unworthy of the Duke's hand, now stood before the royal court presenting evidence that had lain buried for 20 years. Birth records, sealed testimonies, and the long-suppressed truth of Duchess Rosalind Ashcombe's murder. "The evidence is unequivocal," Bramwell announced to the assembled council, his tone considerably more humble than it had been weeks earlier. "Isabella Vane is, in fact, Lady Isabella Ashcombe, sole surviving heir to the Ashcombe title and lands, wrongfully stripped from her family 2 decades ago through fraud and violence." Isabella, standing beside Edmund in a gown of deep sapphire, felt the weight of the entire court's stunned gaze settle upon her. No longer the seamstress's niece who had scandalized the nobility, but a lady in her own right, with a legacy finally restored. Edmund took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in full view of the court, a silent, unmistakable declaration. "The Crown recognizes Lady Isabella Ashcombe's claim," the king himself announced, "and further recognizes her marriage to Duke Edmund Draven as both legitimate and, given the circumstances, remarkably fortunate for the continued strength of Ravenshold's founding bloodline." A ripple of applause moved through the court. Genuine, this time. Not the polite performance of nobility, but real, warm celebration. That evening, that night, alone at last in the ducal bedchamber that had once held only heartbreak, Edmund drew Isabella into his arms beneath the same candlelight that had witnessed her disappearance weeks earlier. "We're finally safe," she whispered, resting her forehead against his chest. "We are," he agreed, tilting her chin up to meet his eyes. "But I need you to understand something, Isabella. I did not marry a title, or a legacy, or a scandal the court will talk about for years to come." His voice softened, raw with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "I married you, the woman who laughed at my terrible jokes in a workshop full of silk, the woman who looked at me like I was simply a man, not a duke. That is who I have loved since the very first night I saw you." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, happy ones, this time. "And I married a man who chased me through scandal, danger, and an entire kingdom's disapproval, and never once let go. I will never let go," he murmured against her lips. "Not for anything, not for anyone." Their kiss deepened, slow and reverent, carrying within it every fear survived and every promise finally, fully kept. The candlelight flickered low, and the world outside the palace walls faded into gentle, golden silence, leaving only the two of them, wrapped in a love that had weathered blood, betrayal, and the darkest edges of royal scandal to finally, truly begin. 1 year later, the gardens of Ravenshold bloomed brilliantly with early summer roses as the court gathered once more. Not for scandal this time, but for celebration. Duke Edmund Draven stood at the edge of the crowd, watching his wife move gracefully among their guests, one hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her stomach. Isabella, Duchess Isabella Ashcombe Draven, her mother's legacy finally, fully restored alongside her own, caught his gaze across the garden and smiled, a smile that still, after everything, made the untouchable Duke's heart forget how to beat properly. He crossed to her, resting his hand gently over hers. "Our child," he murmured, still thick in his voice even months after the news, "will inherit a legacy no one can ever steal from them again." "Our child," Isabella corrected softly, leaning into him, "will inherit a love story stronger than any scandal this kingdom has ever survived." Edmund pressed a kiss to her temple, and beneath the golden light of a Ravenshold summer, surrounded by the very court that had once doubted them, the Duke and his Duchess stood together, proof, finally and forever, that love had conquered every shadow sent to destroy it. If this story swept you away, let us know in the comments. Did you see the twist coming? Give this video a like, subscribe for more forbidden royal romances, and ring that bell so you never miss the next dark, dangerous, devastatingly beautiful love story. Until next time, this has been the Royal Duke Diaries, where every scandal hides a love worth fighting for.